Sound check 1 2 3. Sound check 1 2 3.
Co-chair, we are live.
Wonderful. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to call the meeting to order. Madam Clerk, can you please confirm that quorum is present?
Yes, Madam Co-chair, quorum is present.
Then we'll start with the land acknowledgement. The City of Hamilton is situated upon the traditional territories of Erie, Neutral, and Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and Mississaugas. The land is covered by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, which was an agreement between the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe to share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. We further acknowledge that this land is covered by the Between the Lakes Purchase of 1792 between the Crown and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nations. Today, the City of Hamilton is home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island around North America, and we recognize that we must do more to learn about the rich history of this land so that we can better understand our roles as residents, neighbors, partners, and caretakers. I ask everybody now that all electronic devices be switched to a non-audible function during the committee, if we may. And we start with the agenda. Can we please have an approval of the agenda? Madam Clerk, are there any changes to the agenda?
Yes, Madam Co-chair, we have under discussion items, public engagement update. Item A, communication respecting public engagement and opportunities. Item B, interested parties engagement plan. Item C, public survey. And item D, project work plan.
Thank you. May I please have a mover and a seconder to approve the agenda as amended? Mark? Tanashi, second. Are there any questions on the agenda as presented? All in favor, please indicate your vote now. Motion is carried.
Madam Co-chair, if I can just pause for one
Yes.
moment. Madeline has joined us, and I just want to make sure that her microphone is working. Good morning, Madeline. It's Lorraine Kohler from the clerk's office. How are you today?
Good morning, Lorraine. I'm doing well. Good morning, everyone.
Thanks for joining us today.
Declarations of interest. Are there any declarations of interest? If there are none, those who have not voted, hang on here. If there are any, there are none. So we'll move on into the next one. Let's move on. Now, before we get started, I'd like to do a roll call. Just have everybody introduce themselves before we get into the agenda, if we may. And if we could start down here.
Excellent. Jesse Shea, Director of Public Affairs at Enterprise Canada.
Hello, my name is Grace Baxter, and I'm a public affairs consultant also at Enterprise Canada.
Good morning. My name is Kim Martin. I'm the Executive Director at the Social Planning and Research Council.
Good morning. I'm Tanashi Wingfield, and I'm a member of the task force.
I'm Joanne Santucci, co-chair of the task force.
Morning, everyone. Mark John Stewart, co-chair of the task force, and really glad to have our first meeting today with our project partners and task force, so our full team assembled.
That's right. Let's go over to the city, then we'll go up to the wall. Lorraine?
I'm Lorraine Kohler. I'm the legislative coordinator for the task force.
Rebecca Banke, Project Manager, Community Inclusion and Equity.
Wynn Baker, Stakeholder Relations and Strategic Initiative Specialist with the Mayor's Office.
Calvin Reed, Director of Public Relations with Enterprise Canada.
And may we go up here? Madeline?
Good morning, everyone. Madeline Verhofstadt, member of the task force.
Ted?
Hi, everybody. Greg Tedesco, Senior Project Manager at the City of Hamilton, Government Relations and Community Engagement.
Wonderful. Thank you. We have a mover and a seconder to put the minutes on the floor. Mover, Tanashi, seconder, Mark. Are there any questions? Madeline?
I had raised my hand to approve the minutes and then lowered it. No questions. Thank you.
Okay, no questions. Anybody? If not, then we will vote on the minutes for the previous meeting by show of hands. Okay, motion is carried. Now, we did have a delegation request, if I may get into that just for a moment. It was just a request to have a date assigned for that delegation. We kind of misunderstood it. We was actually getting a delegation today. So what do we do here? May I have a mover and a seconder to approve a request for the future meeting? Tanashi. Second, Mark. All in favor? Motion's carried. Discussion items. Now, Mark, I want to lean on you for a little bit. Are these in the right order that you want them discussed as we take it? Okay, wonderful. So what we're going to do here is we're going to discuss all of them, get to the end of all of them, and then pass them all in one motion, right? So we're going to start with the Mayor's Task Force on Transparency, Accessibility, and Accountability, the communication respecting public engagement opportunities. And I'm opening the floor to anybody who has any questions about the document itself.
Yeah, thanks, Joanne, and I'll just layer in here. So in general, as mentioned, great to have everybody around the table here in person and virtually. Our team assembled for moving to this next important phase of our project, which is our actual active public engagement activities, after which we'll look forward to bringing all our inputs together and then formulating our report and recommendations. So as noted, prior to this meeting, we formally brought Enterprise and SPRC Hamilton on board. We did have an opportunity for Joanne and I to meet with them and talk about what the kind of key next steps are. Enterprise has done some great work in taking a lead role to put together some of the project elements that we've all had a collective opportunity to look at as part of the meeting materials today. So our overall objective is to basically go through these 4 documents, which are representative of key elements of our project, to have the opportunity to have a working meeting together with the team, as well city staff are here with us if there's any questions or comments, or for them to engage with the information. And the goal will be to get as far as we can with these elements so that we're able to basically go out and deploy them into our public engagement activities. And the last element, we'll be looking at the work plan, so we'll kind of roll up with looking at the actual schedule for how we're going to do that. So yeah, the documents, I think, Joanne, to your question, are in a useful order to go through in order to systematically work through our collective perspectives on the topics that are presented. So yeah, the first one we have here, the communication about public engagement opportunities. I think there's a core thesis as we go out to the public in terms of saying, this is the information we're looking to solicit as input. People could infer it from our mandate for the task force or for the conversations that we've had to date that are public, but we thought it'd be useful for it to be more explicit. So the way the note is written here is basically stating the communication we want to make to our publics, and noting that in different circumstances, such as if this is being published on the Engage Hamilton platform, or if we're hosting a delegation, we might say it verbally, that this is kind of the core communication that would be just slightly adapted with whatever context is appropriate to the mediums or situations. So yeah, to your point, Joanne, I think the floor is open. Enterprise, I know you took a lead role in some of the authoring. SPRC, obviously warmly welcome your perspectives on making sure this communication speaks to your audience as well. Obviously, city staff, members of the task force, any perspectives on making sure that this is essentially what we want to say to everybody as we go to public.
Any comments, any changes, any additions, any comments?
Or maybe we all think it's great and ready to roll.
Fantastic, all right.
I mean, I will just say it's great. It seems like a very succinct, clear document, and I think a great way to start. I can't see anything else that's missing, and I often am good at seeing the things that are missing. So yeah. So thank you.
Most welcome, and appreciate the comments. And I think maybe just to comment and reinforce the point that you made, Mark. I think essentially what we have here is that sort of core thesis that will continue. I don't want to say refine, but the central themes and the central comments of what we're looking for in this draft language would be carried through in sort of every opportunity that we seek to collect feedback. But then the parameters of the actual, the specific details in the actual top half might change on a case-by-case basis, just to sort of clearly make sure that folks that are engaging with the consultation process understand exactly how to engage in that process through that medium.
Jesse, while we're having the initial conversation together, maybe you could just quickly table and touch on the 4 themes, and it's really just to validate for all of us collectively while we're here. Transparency, access, accountability, trust are really big words. This committee does not have the bandwidth or mandate to, touch on every single thing that happens in the remit of the city of Hamilton. And so we want to make sure that there's an appropriate framing when we're inviting people to kind of narrow their input into the channels that we're really interested in. So I think that these pillars are quite significant, and that we'll be reiterating them for people. So maybe just quickly, you could kind of run through them and just, everybody can react to make sure we're on the same page, because this will pop up again in the other documents as well.
Of course. So I'll walk through the 4 pillars, and I'll also maybe just explain from the onset, as well as we were thinking about how to frame the 4 different pillars, really what the work was, or what the goal and the outcomes of the task force is really meant to provide these recommendations to council and get to a place where there are practical changes being implemented by the city coming from this process. So we sort of I don't want to say reverse engineered, but we sort of took the approach from the back of, if we have to get to a place from specific recommendations. Of course, when we're talking about trust and talking about accountability with the city, residents, community stakeholders, there's going to be 1,000 different things that jump into everybody's mind, from personal experience and personal interactions that will shape how people want to interact with this. And I think what this consultation is designed to do is to allow residents and allow all the community stakeholders to come with that personal viewpoint, come with those specific themes, specific ideas, specific comments, specific challenges of their interactions with the city, but then guide it to a way that we're getting to the actual changes and the actual way that we can move forward. So when looking at that and we talk about access, we see access as sort of a continuation of some of the work that the city's done around reimagining public participation, where access really is about consultation. It really is about how you choose as an individual in the community to communicate with and try to talk to the city. So how can you do that, and how can we improve that through the challenges that you've seen? From transparency, whether it's attached to consultations or bylaw planning or any actions that the city takes, from closing a community park to a weather advisory to communicating about significant challenges that the city is facing. Can people see from a transparent manner? Can people see how these decisions were made and how we got to the point that we got to today? Often when we talk about a lot of these themes, it really does come back to communications, and communications is sort of at the heart of all of this. So what, from a transparency perspective, can the city be doing, and can the city improve upon as it comes to communicating and being upfront and transparent in the decisions that they're making? When it comes to accountability, it sort of ties into both transparency and access a little bit. We sort of see this as that why node between the two of them. It's great to understand why the city made the decision that they're making. It's great that residents and individuals have the opportunity to communicate to the city what they feel they should do. One thing that we often find is missing when talking about trust and transparency and access is the actual delineation and the actual processing of the comments that get brought forward in consultations like this, in terms of we heard your feedback, and this is why we ended up where we did. So really, from an accountability perspective, it's not so much that, it's not lost on anybody that the city can't do exactly what every single resident wants to do, as everyone's going to have very differing opinions of what they want. But trying to get to a place where there's a better operation in terms of understanding from a citizen's perspective, or a resident's perspective of the community, of how they got to that decision and how their feedback was addressed or couldn't be addressed through the city's operation. And then finally, woven through all these different themes is, our goal here is practical changes and practical updates. Everyone wants to see trust and accountability and access improved in this city, but there are a myriad of ways that they could be changed and they could be addressed. So we really want to make sure that through all of these consultations, whether it's with community members, whether it's with city staff or city departments or councilors or the mayor's office, we really want to make sure that we're getting to a point that, come December, there is there is a list of practical changes that we feel that we feel are the best for the city and we feel are the best presented to actually get implemented and actually make positive changes. Happy
Thank
to
you.
answer any questions on that.
Oh, that's great.
Thanks, Jesse. Yeah, I appreciate the extensive articulation and noting for everybody as well. If you look at our 4 pillars, they quite literally build off the words that we're focused on, right? Access, transparency, accountability, and trust. Kim, I'm just interested hearing your perspective in terms of this communication going out to the audiences that the SPRC may be leading engagement with, and making sure that it will appropriately speak or resonate with those constituencies to make sure that we're able to productively engage them as well.
Yes, thank you. We have been working with Enterprise in terms of some of the nuances as well in terms of the communications document. So certainly from our perspective, we see that there's a clear process. We are having some continuing dialogue in terms of some of the nuances of language to ensure that the document is fully accessible. And that's a process that will be continuing over the next very short while.
Okay, excellent. Any perspectives, members, task force, city? Yep.
Yeah, just a couple of comments about language. There's a few places that this is used, and we're saying citizen. I don't know if we should be saying citizen. Resident, community member, there's better vocabulary than that. We don't need to emphasize Canadian citizenship specifically in the kind of engagement activities. So just bringing that kind of lens to the work is probably important. Another term that we sometimes see, and we're trying to move away from an engagement perspective, is stakeholders. It has a little bit of baggage associated with it. And that's not universal, but it is maybe something we could be putting our best foot forward on. I also wanted to, and then my further comments can wait till we're looking at the other documents, sorry. This looks good though, and I'm
Okay. Excellent. And we're taking some notes as we go along, so excellent points there on the notes to the usage of citizens and stakeholders. So we'll review for those perspectives.
Any other comments?
We'll take that as other than any small refinements that might be made, such as those that have been suggested, we're in alignment with this framing of our outreach. Great.
I like this document. I think it's clear, and I love the pillars. The pillars are really going to actually cinch everything together as dovetail it into those areas, and I think it's going to be great. So thanks for all the hard work on this, everyone. So let's move to the next one, if there's no other comments. Greg, anything? Nope, we're good? Okay. We're going to go to B, Interested Parties Engagement Plan. And again, I open the floor for discussion. I'm wondering, Greg, or Mark, did you want to set this off for a minute? I have some questions about the body of it, but I'll wait till everyone's finished.
Yeah, so a lot to go through here. So what's happened is, there's some initial thoughts on who we'll engage with and how. And that work has been advanced into what this document looks like. So I think we'll take some time to think through it today and make sure that we've articulated basically that we've covered all the audiences that we do want to engage with. We can quickly touch base on just the approach to engagement leads and the activities. We can even have a conversation today about who's doing what in terms of if any of the task force members want to make a point to be actively engaged with any of the particular audiences, and just double checking the methods of engagement. But likewise, again, I can turn over to Enterprise just to kind of table the approach, and then we can get into the specifics.
Perfect, thank you. So essentially, again, this document seeks to sort of set that high level overview of how we're going to seek to collect feedback from as many community members and community groups as we possibly can throughout this process. I think primarily here what the goal is knowing that we have several months ahead of us to try to get this work done. It is unfeasible, no matter how much time and how much effort you spend, to talk to everybody, but we want to ensure that the opportunity to provide feedback and the opportunity to provide comment is given to all. So really that is sort of how this is structured. we see, and we'll get into this a little bit more in the work plan as well, we sort of see all these things happening in unison and happening at the same time in terms of trying to ensure that everyone is given equal opportunity and not one group or one constituency is provided with a longer period to sort of interact with the process than others. So I can go through maybe just at a high level and talk about each sort of group. So starting with sort of the elected officials and key city departments and staff aspect of the conversation, you know, for this, we see this as a you know, a very valuable part of this consultation process, both from the internal workings of the city and understanding what some of the internal challenges and barriers are, as well as to you know, guiding our work in terms of identifying areas in which recommendations and practical changes that the city could take forward actually have some bought in, a bought in nature already. So these interviews are relatively straightforward. We're going to be doing, and Enterprise will largely be leading this work. We'll be doing one-on-one interviews with sort of all of the identified individuals. This is similar to work that the city has done in the past in terms of engaging City Hall and collecting consultative feedback, which is sort of a one-on-one meeting in which, you know, comments are recorded, their opinion is reflective in the overall report, but what we do is we do not attribute any comments directly to that individual or to that councillor or to that city staff member. We find that this works incredibly well in terms of opening up honest and frank conversations about where the city can improve and how we can change things. So we'll take that approach. We'll take that approach through all these different delegations. Something that we offered up last time that we will continue to do this time is whether or not if a conversation is not applicable or it's hard to schedule that conversation, we will provide an opportunity to get these writings in or get these answers in writing so that we can still make sure that they're reflective in the final report. And one thing maybe to note that may be in this, that I believe is in this document, but might not be in this document, is that we will ensure that once the final report is out, we'll make sure to acknowledge all of those who took the time to participate in this survey. Moving on from there, actually, maybe I'll pause there to see if anybody has any questions specifically to the city engagements before moving on.
I have a question, just on number one. Is this an open invite? Did we just select who it is we're going to be speaking to from the city? Is there a roster of how we do that?
So with that list, essentially that list will need to be refined and worked on amongst our group to get to the exact to the specific folks that we would like to talk to. Generally speaking, in terms of trying to ensure that it's an open and fair process, is we tend to gravitate towards interacting with some of the senior leadership and some of the managers on the teams that maybe have a bit more of a holistic viewpoint. That said, you know, we do want to make sure that this is open to everybody. So I think throughout all of our engagements, and I think we'll come to this when speaking about the survey questions as well, we want to ensure that there's an opportunity for every conversation to potentially lead to other conversations. So I think throughout the process and throughout the interviews, as we're talking to team managers, we may come across other individuals or may get recommended other individuals that we should speak to within the city, within the corporation, that would be beneficial to include in our process.
In any of your work in the past, have you actually sent a survey to the workers of the city themselves?
A survey to workers themselves were not included. Wasn't in the evictions?
Yeah, well, no, it wasn't really in the scope of the projects we worked on those. We haven't done that yet, but it's obviously not beyond the realm of possibility. We can absolutely do that.
Because I think it could provide a certain aspect that would be very useful for us. Second, third, I wanted to talk to you a bit about the doing things confidentially. I think we have to have that in everything we're doing, but also say if you have a delegation coming to our public meetings, that's open and we can't do anything about that. So that way they know there's only one instance where that might be not, you know, held up, that the whole public will be watching. So I think we really need to, we could take notes too about tagging stuff to other things. We really have to have that everywhere.
Absolutely, and I think that is maybe an important a really important piece to this is that, generally speaking, to your point, outside of the public delegations in which you're going to be here as a person and verbally providing your
Sometimes it's just not
thoughts.
obvious,
Everything that's being done is anonymous and is not going to be reflective or tied back to an individual person. And one thing that I think will be good to center around, especially with these interviews, focus groups, and some of the survey questions, is while feedback and while comments are going to be made anonymous, specific quotes or specific comments that are made across any different group could find themselves reflective in the final report. Again, not attributed to a single person. It would be, they could be slightly tweaked to ensure that anonymity is given to the person that provided it. But the one thing that we find is, incredibly reflective and actually kind of builds into what the task force is trying to do, is ensuring that the actual comments and the actual words and the actual quotes and experiences that people are going to be bringing forward are actually reflective in that final report and tied to the recommendations and to the decisions that were made on how the report is presented in the end.
Thank you. Last but not least, we'll go to Tinashe. Go, Tinashe.
Again, thank you for putting this together. I guess wanted to ask and offer maybe a different way of thinking about this. I guess from my perspective, for people who are residents of Hamilton, when they look at the task force and the work that we're trying to do, they might ask, how is this different than, let's say, other times that similar, committees have been put together? And one of the things that jumps out at me in looking at this is just how we often think about, I guess we have a hierarchy in terms of how we think about engaging people and the community. So even the framing of the document, I wonder if we could think about it as citizens first and then basically flip everything backwards, so that really it's about, well, residents, or whatever word we land on, that's helpful. But rather than sort of leading with elected officials, key people, might be one way of thinking about it. And that's essentially the spirit of the document might benefit from just inversely looking at it that way. And then specifically looking at, I guess, each target group, when we look at the city, from my perspective, I would be more interested in maybe identifying not senior members of the city to ask these questions, but intentionally doing one-on-one interviews with, I don't know how we map out who, but I think there's so much value, more value again, for the purpose and the mission and the mandate of what our task force is hoping to at least gather. Might there be a way for us to map out who are the rock stars, the people who are in community, who are doing work or in whatever department, prioritizing the worker's voice over the manager, like the sort of city councilor and whoever. And again, that applies to everything else. So even looking at the other sections, might there be a way to kind of bring out that voice that usually we tap CEOs, EDs, blah, blah, blah. But we're hoping to also hear from everybody else. So I don't know if it's more of a question and an offer. I don't know if you have anything to say to that.
No, of course, no, and I appreciate the comment and I appreciate the thought process, and I think that's, these things have been not baked into our thought process, but these things have consistently come up in our thinking in terms of how to go about this. Especially as we've been fortunate enough to support the city in past engagement work. We also realize from an operational perspective that some of the groups that we're reaching out to, we have reached out to talk about very similar themes before in past conversations. So really what we are trying to do and what has maybe shifted from our initial thinking is just that, is in terms of how can we, there's a number of different viewpoints, a number of different perspectives that we need to try to capture in this if we're going to get to a point of having really strong practical recommendations while also reflecting the community. So I think on one hand, very much agree with a shift in the document to be citizens first, because truthfully this is citizens first. We want to ensure, and it was reflected in the work plan, that residents first, while over the course of the next month, we may begin setting up one-on-one interviews and start scheduling them. Our goal is to not actually begin that consultative process until community groups and until residents are able to also feed into it, so that everyone, again, as I mentioned earlier, is provided that same window of time and that same opportunity. On reaching out to different groups, I think looking at focus groups and looking at different ways to structure our engagements when it comes to community partners, I think is going to be important, because we don't want to, we want to ensure that the people that we always go to, again, have the opportunity to participate, but completely align that we're more interested in differing viewpoints and some differing perspectives on how this works operationally. I mean, when we're talking about trust, when we're talking about accountability, when we're talking about the themes that we're exploring in these surveys, the truth of the matter is, if we go back to the same stakeholder universe that past consultations have engaged, they are unlikely to fix the problems that the task force is seeking to fix in the community, because no organization and no community partner is actually going to be reflective of an average resident's voice, of how the city operates, or where they perceive their challenges are with city operations on trust and accountability. So completely aligned. I think it would be great to try to get into, I don't want to say get into the weeds, but get into more junior level and front level facing folks in the community and across the city and across organizations. I think we'll have to have a conversation about how we do that and how we come to this final list, but then also want to ensure, to a certain degree, that we do extend the opportunity for these conversations to some of the senior leadership of the city, because again, getting to a place where there's actually an ability to recommend practical changes that will have the buy-in of the corporation, and having those people at the table that have sort of that more holistic viewpoint of city operations, I think will be helpful as we distill sort of the community perspectives and how we're going to bring forward the changes. Because I think that's sort of the sweet spot that I think we need to try to find in the final report, or would advise finding in the final report, is these are the changes that are wanted and are needed from the community that actually have a path forward and actually have a way to be implemented and changed.
Yeah, and I think I do know that it is possible. I would be happy to share with you some organizations that are able to do this. Civic Action is one that comes to mind in the region of Hamilton and the GTA. And I think this is the point that will make the difference for the residents, right? So if people don't see regular people being engaged in this process in a meaningful way, it might come back to almost, be like, oh, here's another committee that's been formed and they consulted the same old people. So I think leaning into that discomfort or the inconvenience that probably will come from forcing ourselves to reach out. So maybe it's that if we reach out to an organization, we mandated that at least 30% of the people coming from that organization must actually be residents or frontline workers or whatever it is, rather than senior leadership. Just building that in from the beginning might actually make our report a lot more interesting, rather than it becoming another shelved report. So thank you.
Madeline, go ahead.
Thanks so much, and I love all of that discussion, and in full support of that, really inverting the hierarchy and prioritizing community members and community-based organizations. Hope everybody can hear me okay. I had popped up my hand a little bit earlier in the conversation, and really it was more just as a point of process to ensure, as we look at this engagement strategy, that myself and Bill Custers had put together a listing of different potential community groups and organizations, just wanting to make sure that gets uploaded into these next steps, so that we're not reinventing the wheel as we think about our engagement process. I see some heads nodding, so I assumed that was the case, but didn't see it, I don't think, specifically reflected in this document. So wanted to verify. Thanks so much.
Perfect. No, and just to just to ensure clarity on this, the target audience, I would say, is a slightly rephrased catch-alls from that original list that was drafted. And then the audience groups, and specifically, should be directly referencing the audience groups listed out in that last document.
Any other questions before we move on? No? No? Okay. Thank you.
Most welcome. Excellent. So going down a little bit further into the community organizations and sort of institutional partners part of these engagements, really this comes down to this is quite a broad section as it captures sort of everybody that is not a resident of the city, and we'll talk a little bit more in that section about that definition of residence, as I think there's some language that we can utilize there to expand it. But this really comes down to all groups and community groups within the city of Hamilton that interact with the city. So in this one and in this sort of outreach, we really see sort of three kind of key ways to provide and solicit input here. One of which is through surveys, whether it's the Engage Hamilton survey that's online or specific surveys that are targeted towards that sector or that audience group, as well as focus groups of having some sit-down conversations with a number of individuals to provide their comments and their feedback. I think baked into this process and something that we had thought about in terms of frontline worker and capturing sort of a more holistic voices is how we utilize these focus groups and how we utilize sort of the survey distribution. So we want to ensure that as we're doing any sort of outreach to any organization, that it is met with, hey, we're inviting you to participate, identify the way in which we want that organization to participate. So whether it's an invitation to a focus group, whether it's an invitation to respond to a specific sector-oriented survey, but then following up to ensure that they are aware of the Engage Hamilton online survey, so that can be used and that can be disseminated as well through these different community partners, so that whether they're a service delivery partner, whether it's an advocacy organization, whether it's a neighborhood association, that there is a way to further disseminate our materials and further collect that more granular viewpoints, so that again, ensuring that residents and ensuring that those that are on the ground are most reflective in this final conversation or in the final report. Outside of that, we really want to take the approach of yes and throughout this entire engagement. So as we're having these conversations, as we're having these focus group conversations, we really will be trying to look to see what further conversations could be had kind of coming out of every single one, knowing time constraints, knowing that we do have a deadline to try to produce this report and get these recommendations to council at the end of December, but by December. So throughout the process and throughout the time window that we have to engage, really just working the clock up to the last minute to ensure that we get as many voices to the table as humanly possible.
If I may ask a question, Jay, we discussed in prior discussions, of course you weren't here, but we discussed that, what if somebody did a delegation that 5 minutes, I think it wasn't enough and they wanted to continue. We should also be putting multiple modes, but also multiple ways, you know what I mean? That if you did a delegation, you didn't get what you wanted in, you could actually do a survey or do a written submission. We should have that somewhere so we don't forget about that too.
Absolutely, and I think that's incredibly important here. I think ensuring that folks, ensuring that residents and ensuring that everyone understands that it's not a one and done process per se. And we sort of see this, and it's actually a point that I think we'll come to in the survey question is, again, really wanting to make sure that it's sort of cyclical. So, we intend to draft some language around just also open written submissions, so that anybody that wants to put their thoughts forward but don't feel comfortable going through, the online engagement platform, or maybe want to write in a letter or send in an email, have some sort of the similar language in which they can just provide sort of, open-ended to an extent thoughts to the task force for us to process their comments and their feedback, as well as ensuring that everything we're doing, again, leading to further conversations. So specifically when talking about the survey question in the Engage Hamilton survey, something that is not reflective in that document right now that we think should be reflected in that document is do you want further engagement on with this process, whether it be a public delegation or whether it be a potential invitation to a focus group? Yes or no? Are you associated with a community stakeholder or a community partner in the city? Yes or no? Do you self-identify as an equity deserving group in the city? Yes or no? So that allows us in the back end to process between SPRC, how we can sort of ensure that everyone is getting that opportunity to reach out. And it's, again, not a one and done process by any means.
The format on roundtables I found very interesting, because I think for vulnerable communities, it would be an asset for them to gather together and talk, at a roundtable. But is there anything other than vulnerable communities that we would want to do a roundtable for? What are they usually used for in the past?
I think roundtables can be a positive way of soliciting feedback and getting reaching out to some audiences that maybe don't have the confidence in engaging in other manners, whether it's a sit down, whether it's a one-on-one interview could seem a little intimidating, or they there might be some benefit of having like-minded individuals or like-minded folks at the table. So I think when it comes to our thought processes outside of the equity deserving groups and the work that SPRC is going to be doing, the work in and around, as we think about engaging with the business community, the business community is going to have viewpoints on how they interact with the city and how they feel the city operates when it comes to trust and access and transparency. Obviously, much like residents, there are many businesses that exist in the city of Hamilton, and it could take a considerable amount of time to reach out and to solicit sort of that right amount of feedback. Where I think there are opportunities that we specifically are interested in when it comes to the focus groups is this something where we're reaching out to a partner organization or another organization, let's say like the Hamilton Chamber of Commerce, where we can say, hey, we would like to partner with you to do a roundtable where we can explore these themes with people that you think are interested, where they can bring some voices to the table, and we can process that information. Same thing comes to mind when we're talking about, whether it's community sports groups and different, sports leagues that operate in the city that are impacted by city decision making. Maybe there's a roundtable with voices that, reflect different parts of the city on that front. Same, accessibility organizations, community and neighborhood associations. There are probably many different opportunities where we can sort of leverage stakeholders in the city or community partners in the city that are sort of always there to support and to provide their feedback, and how can we work with them to ensure that we're capturing a myriad of voices and additional folks at the table.
I'm curious what city staff think about this process, and what are some things that we should be thinking about that we haven't?
I can jump in quickly. Apologies, I had to jump off for a couple minutes, so I might have missed part of the conversation. I think one of the items that we can definitely support with kind of in the next phases of this, when we go through, or when the group goes through kind of the questions, is we can layer on again, similar to when we had the presentation earlier this year from our public engagement team, just to make sure we're not duplicating engagement that is done before, where we've received specific feedback on those items, and instead use that to kind of complement what a final report might look like with some of the recommendations, right? Because I think, as we've discussed, we don't And as others have raised here, we don't want to go back and ask the exact same questions that have been asked before. And I think that's where that, again, leads into some of those questions from residents, resident groups, others in the community around, what is the point, or why are we doing this? We've already done this. We've already provided the feedback. So I think that's some of the analysis that our team can support on from an evaluation perspective to ensure that what those questions are being asked when they're developed are unique to specific items that have been brought forward. And then to layer in, again, some of that existing feedback and documentation that if it's not part of the, to help that inform what those final recommendations might be, or to complement what those recommendations might be from a more holistic perspective to say, these are still some outstanding items. This is what the results were of some of that engagement. But I'm really trying to ensure that this is as much as possible, obviously, a unique set of questions, a unique type of engagement that is going out there, and not a replication of something that has happened. And if there is something that is similar but a little bit different, maybe it's just a contextual shift in some of that, right? I know we had brought up some of the reimagining public participation consultation that had been done a few years ago. And I think there might be some overlap there in terms of some of the types of questions, but I think there might be a unique kind of perspective that might be kind of layered into this understanding, some of the context that has changed through the onset of COVID and over the last few years from an engagement perspective, that it might be helpful to just shift where some of those questions are and how they're framed. So we can support with that as the evaluation process moves forward. And then I think I had seen some elements related to Engage Hamilton and its potential use. And I know that we had discussed this, and I think this is maybe just a thought that we can kind of leave to the group to have more of a discussion as the planning goes on. But I do wonder from an online perspective if that's necessarily the best format for that survey to be conducted. And I just want to put that out there just to say, understanding that this is the task force that is leading this, with, the support of SPRC and Enterprise, the information that would be collected would be on a city website or a city organized website. And so just understanding how this has been established, to have that be arm's length from the city and from city staff, that just might be a conversation to be had there in terms of, is that the best platform to utilize for this specific engagement, for that online portion? And maybe if there's an opportunity to look at something else. And obviously if there's a survey or something like that, with the uptake there, like we could promote it through our channels and our email lists and different things like that, and help promote something like that through some of our channels that we have with community organizations and community groups. But just a thought on that in terms of why we might consider not necessarily utilizing Engage Hamilton as the platform for some of that online engagement. I'll leave it there.
Thank you for that, Ted. Okay, Mark?
Yeah, I'm just going to jump in. So a really good conversation. I just want to table, so I do think it's important because we are working on very broad topics that touch everybody really, right? Like every organization, everyone that's in Hamilton. So just to retable, we do have to take a representative approach. There's 500,000 plus people in Hamilton. There's thousands of organizations, 8,000 city staff. There's just no way, unless we were to drastically change the parameters of our work, which is that we want to deliver a report by the end of the year. We have a certain scope of contract with SPRC and Enterprise. So balancing the desire to literally hear everybody with the fact that we won't literally hear everybody, and doing our best job to take the way that we categorize everybody in every organization and make sure that we've A, definitely given everybody the opportunity, and B, done best effort to solicit proactively insight, and especially making an effort to consider the diversity of ways and people and organizations we want to engage with. I do have some comments just on the chart here, but Kim, also want to hear from you. Just there's been a lot of conversation around our diverse, intentional outreach to communities. And I know SPRC is taking a lead on some of those activities. So
Thank you. So for our part of this engagement, we're looking at reaching out to residents in Hamilton that are equity deserving members, self-identify as being members of equity deserving groups. And our method of engagement will primarily be through focus groups. And we intend to promote that through outreach efforts in the community. We're very cognizant that there needs to be also a diversity of ways that people can engage even in a focus group. And so we're looking at doing, at least offering virtual as well as in-person sessions. We're looking at how do we reduce some of the barriers that people face for engagement in a process like this. And so we are trying to make the process as accessible for people in Hamilton to participate and to give their feedback. We're also looking at how do we simplify and make it really clear to the community in terms of what we're asking for and the purpose and how this will play out in terms of recommendations. So the other thing that we've talked about as well is just in terms of how we can help promote the survey that is also, whether that's through Engage Hamilton or through another medium, with, equity deserving groups. How do we make that accessible to them? Noting that technology can be a significant barrier, that there is a digital divide. Knowing that there are barriers for people to do delegations. Some people don't want to be on a live stream and do a presentation in front of a committee of people. And so internally, we're talking about how, if people do want to do that, how can we make that easier for them? How can we help educate them on the process of even performing a delegation and what's involved? So really our key focus is on reducing barriers so that we can have participation from as many people in Hamilton as possible for this process. And some of those methods are actually still being discussed and talked about, and we also want to be engaging with community members in terms of what will work for them. And so we have this balance between wanting to, wanting to offer some solutions in terms of what we're proposing, but also very much being open to how people want to engage and prioritizing their experience in this process. I also would just add, if I can, that although we talk about these different, we talk about different groups that will be approached, but there is such great intersectionality. And so, recognizing that as well is really important for us, that there isn't just a, there isn't just a community of healthcare providers, or there isn't just a community of community leaders. There are so many intersections within that, and we want to honor that in the process.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kim. And so taking lots of notes as we're going through, but really appreciate the perspective on the SPRC's approach and how that layers in. For all of us, and with this being a plan, we're very near to needing to take, and I'm going to kind of reference the chart that was prepared, take that to the next level very soon, which is, there are these activities and there are these target audiences, and we have to turn those into the literal target audiences and the literal activities that we will undertake. I think I appreciate the way things are laid out right now in this matrix, where we have the primary chunks of audiences. I think you've effectively identified the ideal engagement leads. As a general comment, I think we should set an aspiration that when Enterprise or SPRC are going out to do specific proactive engagements, we try and line up a member of the task force with all of those activities. Could be more than one, but try and have somebody there, and that way we have all of our kind of feelers out in those activities as well. So again, that will probably be articulated outside of today, but just when we get to that literal checklist of all the exact activities. I do think as well the methods of engagement that have been identified for the given audience are the right methods. I think that when we communicate with those audiences, we make a point to say, hey, you can engage all of these different ways. So for the general audience, residents and general audiences, surveying delegations and written submissions. For some of the specific audiences, there will be the one-on-one interviews, such as the city staff and council. And then for some of the grouped audiences, like partners or community organizations, likely some folks groups as well. So I think, to me, this chart is correct and just ready to move to the next step of kind of the literal activities. I would sum it up that way.
Alrighty.
So, yeah, and Joanne, just to kind of consolidate, where do we go from here? So there is that next step of getting to the literal tasks. And I think there was a lot of good conversation for a number of people that chipped in about just some of the updating to some of the nuances of the approach, right? And making sure, really good perspectives on how we consider the voices of city staff at different levels, knowing we won't talk to 8,000 city staff, but a senior voice is very important because it has the literal responsibility of the task on behalf of the city, but also there's frontline perspectives that are very insightful. So we'll roll in some of those thoughts into the overall approach.
Yeah, I like that. Okay. Is there any more information on the engagement plan? I'm wondering if we wanted to solicit any interest in any area, anybody, or we want to wait till we actually get those dates down and then everybody can jump in at that moment in time. What would you like to do?
If I may add, Lorraine Kohler from the
Yes.
Clerk's Office, Legislative Coordinator. The Clerk's Office will be giving support to the delegations and the written submissions. I suggest that we use the clerk@hamilton email address, which we already have in place. We already have a process to take in. I've actually already started receiving some emails from folks who want to write in or possibly delegate. So that is already in place and that can be used.
Thank you.
We'll get the exact language from you, and then we'll literally put that into our comms. Yeah.
Sorry, something just creeped up on me. The other group, which I might have raised this at a previous meeting, but I've been thinking about how young people could actually be their own stakeholder group or community group, in that, first of all, I'm not going to be here in a couple of years, and they are, and the city is theirs, really. And I think that maybe, and I don't know how in the back end you might work this, but almost finding interesting ways to look at them as a chunk of a group that could be engaged, and that might serve us well as well when we're thinking about the surveys online and finding ways to make that actually interesting, TikTok it or whatever it is that they're doing. But yeah, I think it's both in terms of actually getting their thoughts on their future in the city, and then also getting them to support our efforts in taking a survey cool again.
Thanks, Tashi.
Absolutely, and I'll say maybe just as way of comment, I think for this document and to make sure we're all on the same page and it's clearly on the record. Putting together these engagement plans and putting together these methods of engagement, the groups that we're reaching out to, and so on and so forth. I would say our viewpoint of this is that these are very much living documents and very much sort of let's call them the North Star in terms of general mode of operata or general modes of engagement and general process. This is what we're trying to accomplish, but then the actual kind of core to this is ensuring that we're providing an accessible opportunity to engage to as many people as humanly possible. So throughout this process and throughout the next few months, as we have continued conversations and as conversations like this pop up in terms of how do we further engage youth, how do we, great, we're a month into this, we've talked to these 5 different community groups, or we have representation from these 10 wards. We now need to go out and figure out how we're going to approach the other 5 to get additional feedback. We very much will continue to sort of alter this plan, make checks, make little nuanced changes to continue that outreach. Primarily, again, Mark, to your point, there is no world in which we are going to speak to everybody. That said, I think by the end of this process, we all want to make sure that we can look at what we have done and say, but we tried. And as long as we have tried, and as long as we, have done something, or there is an engagement method that we know is applicable or is accessible to a certain group, we at least know at the end of the day that we have tried to get to as many places as humanly possible. and reflective, and I realize this will come up a little bit in the survey questions as well, is just around the language around residents and citizens. By no means citizens, when it was drafted in this document, was meant to imply Canadian citizens. It was meant to imply anybody that lives in the city. That said, I think even from further thinking and further reflection on this, that also is too narrow of a scope of what we would want to try to capture when it comes to residents. So I think one change that we would want to make in this document is if we change the language as citizens around to residents, and then as well in that in sort of that descriptor underneath it that provides a bit more clarity in who we're wanting to talk to, would open or leave the comment to the floor that, an impetus around those who live, work, or study or live, work, or play in the city of Hamilton is probably the approach that we want to take as it comes to residents, to ensure that we're getting those that come into, whether it's post-secondary sports leagues or anything like that, just to have that broader, also thinking of out-of-town folks that rely on HSR or other city programs that might have pertinent thoughts to share as it pertains to what we're exploring in these themes.
Righty. Rebecca.
Let me just provide a couple of comments, sorry. I appreciate the reframing of residents. I think we just want to be kind of inclusive in how we're making this pitch. And the last thing you want to do is immediately alienate people, right? I was going to mention, I appreciate that Kim brought up the idea of like focus groups, especially when we talk about engaging with equity deserving groups or the sort of IDEA lens that the city uses. It's really important to meet those people in their communities where they are and to connect with them. And initially when I saw this, it was online surveys, delegations, and written submissions. One, that doesn't acknowledge digital divide. Two, that puts a lot of onus on those communities to come forward. And typically there's a lot of reasons why those communities don't come forward in those methodologies. So I'm glad that that's there, and I appreciate the emphasis being put on that part of it, and that this is not like a complete kind of robust thing. If it were me layering methods around this, I might look at, like a town hall or like a round table or something like that that could include those kind of conversations that might be a little bit less bureaucratic. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody up here? Wow, that was quite a great discussion on this document, man. Holy smokes. Okay, so we're going to move on to the survey. If there's no other questions or concerns or comments, anyone? Thank you for that. That was a great discussion. We're going to move on to the public survey. Now, I don't know how to really approach this, so I think I'll lean on yourself, Jay, to just give us an overview of what we're going to be looking at. Does anybody have any specific things they want to talk about? We're not going to be wordsmithing the thing.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, Joanne, I'll just add some context. So overall, we do want to have a survey. And to your point previously made, Rebecca, with some of those methods, some of them are just basically that say the survey, it's open to everybody. Whereas then some of the specific audiences we're going to be going to directly. So the survey is something which is a broad-based, easily accessible for many people forum to be able to provide input. And so that will be one of the broad things, the ability to delegate and written submissions. Those are the things that'll be basically open to everybody. The survey in particular, however, we do want to have a great survey, and this is also a representative conversation of the, let's say, bounding box of topics and framing that we want to present more broadly. When we go to other audiences, such as one-on-one interviews or focus groups, it'll also kind of build off this or be in alignment with this kind of general scope, so that our scope is kind of not unlimited. So I think, very interested to hear everybody's perspectives on what is being presented, because it'll be presented in the survey, but also generally as the scope of information that we're interested in soliciting. So really interested to hear everyone's perspectives. And we'll turn over Jesse for some context.
Perfect, thank you. So starting off, and Mark, you sort of just made this comment, and we'll reiterate, what we have in front of us is sort of drafted questions for what would be an online survey, whether it's Engage Hamilton or set up somewhere else. I think when taking the approach of drafting these questions, we really thought about a few different things, and I won't really get into any of the specific questions, and we'll allow the group to ask questions, but just talk about maybe the frame of mind or the thought process that went into these questions or went into this process. One of which is, to a comment that Greg made earlier, there has been similar consultations that have been done in the past, or similar themes that have been explored in the past through other city work. That said, when we talk about, let's say, access and the ability to go to bring your thoughts and your comments to City Hall, access includes consultation, and access includes interacting with the city's consultative efforts, but it's also a lot more than just specific to consultations. So some of the questions, and I think there is, again, to Greg's point, maybe some framing or some contextualization that can happen across the different modes here, but really trying to get an idea across all of these things is the unfettered response from a community partner or a resident or whoever of what their perceived challenges or perceived standing is of the city across those different themes of transparency, access, trust, and accountability, so that we can understand not necessarily what the problem is in terms of specifics, but understanding, and again, and we spoke about this at the last meeting, these themes really do center around communication, and it's about communication. It's about how the city talks to its residents, talks to itself, and what it leads information for. And when it comes to communication problems can be everything from a city link wasn't working, or something wasn't posted on the city in an appropriate amount of time, to this is something the city just doesn't do, or I participated in a consultative process and never heard back and have no idea what happened with my comments after I provided them. So we really wanted to provide questions throughout this survey that allowed us to understand the individual person and the individual responder. What was the perspective that they were taking when they were responding? Were they thinking about consultations? Were they thinking about their local community? Were they thinking about garbage pickup? So that we can understand what that, what the framing is, or what some of the actual, what the actual challenges are that people are getting frustrated with that are leading to these issues, or these the issues around transparency or access with the city. Second of which was, again, maybe trying to quantify it and qualify it a little bit more specifically in terms of, here are open-ended questions where we can understand where people's frustrations are about particular issues, but then now categorizing them and how we have to process this in terms of the 4 themes that the task force is going to be exploring and providing recommendations around. And then last but not least, actually focusing here on the practicals. So we've incorporated some language here in terms of dashboards and things like that, just to provide some thought starters to residents and to groups as they're responding to this, and as they're providing their themes and feedback and their opinions. But how we needed to structure this, or how we wanted to structure this, was sort of that funnel approach of, we can understand as anybody comes forward what the fundamental problem is, what is it from their day-to-day is leading their frustrations with how the city operates. Secondly, how can we qualify that and quantify that in a way that we can provide recommendations and we can distill this information to the corporation, so that the corporation can go forward and make substantial changes, or make changes that residents will feel are reflective of what they want to see come out of this process. And then finally, those actual practical changes. It's everybody that we talk to throughout this process will have a problem with the city of Hamilton. Will have a problem with how it operates in some way, shape, or form. That is why they're engaging with this process. Whether it's about communication, whether it's about consultative, it doesn't necessarily mean that the city has fundamentally done something wrong, but they're going to have that viewpoint that the city has had a shortcoming in some way, shape, or form. So how do we get them to a point where, as many people that are bringing forward their concerns and their feedback about where the city can improve, can we lead it to where residents are actually, hey, this is what I would like to see. This is fundamentally, I would complain a lot less about, the city parks being closed due to a weather event if I actually was provided notice an hour and a half before I was trying to get my kid out the door to a baseball game.
Thanks, Jesse. And so appreciate the contextualization of the approach to the construction. I think the floor is wide open for any and all perspectives. I mean, there's a lot that can and is captured within the survey scope. We obviously want to make it comprehensive, useful, insightful, but not indefinitely long. So I like our starting point here, and yeah, interested to hear what everybody has to think.
Rebecca.
Yeah, me again. So I've got a couple of questions. One, some of this might benefit from like a evaluation expertise, because I think that would be a useful perspective to bring to some of these questions. There's things like neutral response bias, and I worry that some of the questions have like a lot of potentially neutral answers that could color how this survey comes back. Really pedantic issue with question number 8. You mentioned the city's online engagement platforms, which the website is not actually an engagement platform, because engagement is a conversation and it's a back and forth with a reporting back process. Engage Hamilton is that, but the website is just a communication tool. So we can either say, how do you feel about the city's online platforms or engagement tools, or pardon me, rather than saying engagement tools, or exclude the website from that particular thing. Also question 9, and I keep coming back to this notion of digital divide because I think it's important, but all of those options are digital, and it might be nice to have some way, if we are engaging with these people from something other than simply Engage Hamilton, to acknowledge that there might be people who have different sets of needs that they're looking for changes around. I had one more thing. Yeah, some of the questions are structured in such a way that like the answers are quite different, and sometimes we like to see like kind of uniform answer sets for types of questions. And I was just wondering if there could be a way to make engaging with the survey itself a little bit less burdensome to the people who are doing so. But there are many things about this that are quite strong, and I'm just trying to find the issues because that's the process, right?
Absolutely, no, and appreciate that. And I think I noted a couple of the changes to the specific questions that you just brought forward, and agreed and happy to make those tweaks and changes. And then again, I think 100% maybe working with the city and the public engagement team. One thing that's not reflective in this, and specifically was sort of added in around like the demographic questions and things like that. Also be curious to work with the city in terms of how the city presents some of the questions and presents some of the answers and how they ask the demographic questions, so that if we are collecting and inputting feedback from other consultations that have relevant information that we can, attach as an appendix to the work that we've done, I think it'd be beneficial if we could try to align this wherever possible to make sure that even though this, to Greg's point, this isn't necessarily a complete city initiative, that this is coming out, this is arm's length from the city, but if we're using city resources and if people are still engaging with an arm's length city process, it should all sort of be cohesive. I think we can set out, and I think we're doing a good job of trying to set a gold standard here in terms of how to approach public consultations and how to approach being open and accessible. But then also want to make sure that we're, on the back end from a data processing perspective and qualitative perspective, we're as aligned with the city as possible in terms of the tools and engagement process.
Yeah, go ahead, Rebecca.
It's just one of the interesting things about demographic details is we often don't collect that kind of information with some intention around that choice. It's very common to collect postal codes because that gives us ward data, which is very important to our decision makers. But a lot of the time we avoid collecting demographic data if it's not considered essential to the work that's involved. So it might be worth examining the places where the work aligns with that demographic data pretty critically, because we like to collect as little of that information as is necessary to advance the work.
Absolutely, and I think even to some of the conversations, the demographic point that was in there preceded a conversation that we had with SPRC that came up earlier, in which perhaps we do want to make an edit to this in which people can raise their hand to interact with other avenues and other engagement methods, whether it's delegations or public surveys. So even maybe just having the ability to self-identify as an equity deserving group, or self-identify your association with a community group or community partner, could also, I think ward data is going to be important here to ensure that we've covered our bases, but even perhaps just through some self-identifying questions in which people can choose not to answer or don't have to provide a response, could provide us with some relative information to make sure that we can say that we've reached out and had those interactions.
Rebecca, I'm curious, maybe you could just expound a little bit just for our benefit. It sounds like there's probably been a lot of thought around that okay, someone come on after as well, a particular point. So for example, you put out a set of questions and maybe you have a question, age brackets, and then we're like, oh, wow, okay, young people have this big concern, older people not have similar concern. a recommendation could be put forward about how to do this thing in a way that engages with the younger demographic to address their concern, right? So just as an example, so curious just for all of our knowledge to hear a little further perspective on like the conversations or thoughts to date that have led to that point.
Sure. Greg might have more to say about this, but I think one of the things that's really important is if you think that youth are going to be an important demographic to target, that you scope that clearly and appropriately. You make those kind of questions optional. Typically include them at like the end of a survey rather than the beginning of a survey. That way you're not front-loading people with a lot of personal information that you're asking them for. You're getting at the meat of what the conversation is about, showing them where the merit might be even in that process, and then asking them for the demographic information that they then might logically conclude is appropriate or necessary to collect. So those are some of the steps that we take around that kind of thing. And again, if you think like youth are an important demographic that you want to capture, capturing that, but is it important that I'm a woman to answer this question? Like how much of a factor is that? If it's considered a minimal factor or not really a factor at all, let's not be collecting that information.
Great. Yeah, thanks. You mentioned Greg. I don't know.
Madeline.
Oh, Madeline too.
So thanks so much for those thoughts about the pros and cons of the demographic data collection. I had just raised my hand to highlight that I think if we're looking within the city at a template for how we might collect those data, I'm fairly certain that public health has been doing that through the COVID pandemic. Not sure how actively, but they would have a set of questions that they would have been using through that process that we might kind of reach out and get that info and understand from them whether that set of questions is being used in other city departments or whether this is something that's more tailored to that public health setting. The other thing I just wanted to also mention is that the set of questions that's in the meeting agenda probably already has undergone some kind of further review and edits by the task force group. So just again, emphasizing that this is a draft and really appreciating all of the input so that we can incorporate it all before the question set gets finalized.
Thanks, Madeline. Lynn?
I just have 2 points, just going through as an avid survey taker myself. Question, and I know these aren't the final questions, but question 3 and 6 I find are quite similar. And as a survey taker, I might be confused about how to differentiate between the two of them and how my answers would be different. So I don't know if there's a way to rephrase one of them, or maybe they're not both necessary. The only other thought I had was an open-ended question around if residents feel that the city is already doing something well. And the reason I say that is if there are tools that the city has that we're using that residents feel are good and are effective, I wouldn't want us to inadvertently cut those because we never got feedback that they were good, right? So a question that specifically says, is there something that you feel the city is doing well? Yeah, those are just my thoughts.
Thanks for that. That's a good question. Okay, Dinesh.
I won't go through the questions because I can be really annoying when it comes to survey stuff because I do it for my work. But I wanted to also table another option where to have less questions maybe for certain groups. I just wonder, again, thinking from the residents' perspective, the types of people that take surveys and all the, I guess, traits that they might have and usually reflect a certain type of person, just from, I guess, all of us, we know people who take surveys and people who don't. So I've often found that one of the ways to get around or to encourage people to take surveys is to make them as short as possible. So having 5 really great questions, 3 really great questions sounds like it's nothing, but I've found that it can be a really great tool. And so of course the work then becomes, there's some people who might sit down and be a group to be sending a survey of this length to. So maybe people who work in a formal employment and that sort of thing. But if there's an opportunity to develop another survey, that might be a great thing. The other piece would be the word engage. So I love that word. I use it way too often. But as I've learned from my older family members, is that it doesn't make sense. So it's like innovation to some people who are not necessarily in the space. It's one of those words that's really become buzzy in the last maybe 20 years. I don't know. So I wonder again for that word, if it's just when you were presenting this, you use the word talk, interact. So just more simple language. Thinking of a 15-year-old or a 12-year-old reading the survey, those words seem to make more sense to a broader base of people than some of the words that we love, like engage. So again, just an offer. I don't know alternative words we could use, but when you were presenting this section, you used a number of words that were much simpler than that word or less loaded. So, yeah.
Absolutely, and I think to respond to a variety of comments, I think just in terms of changes and tweaks to the survey questions. One of which is 100% on top of interacting with the city to ensure that there's alignment in terms of how some sort of questions are phrased and languaged. I think going through these to ensure that it's open and accessible language wherever possible is going to be key. Point is also well taken in terms of length. This is a bit longer. I myself, as an avid survey taker, I'm also the type of person that will get halfway through a survey and just go, no, I'm done. I've hit my limit of what I'm willing to answer. So can appreciate the comment, appreciate the feedback quite well. I think the challenge that we're going to run into, and 100% there are tweaks and changes that can be made, is how we're sort of exploring the 4 separate themes in what we need to sort of take out of this. It does automatically lend itself to a bit of a longer survey, unfortunately. So I think there could be some work done, and we could have put some thought around how we can tailor or tweak this to try to cut some questions or use some questions to try to provide a bit more of a catch-all for all the different groupings. And then secondly, also, I think from a terms of an operational perspective of this survey and this going online and what kind of comes next is, and Mark had made this comment earlier and I want to go back to it, is that I, again, would consider this a bit more of the North Star in terms of themes and things we want to explore in surveys and conversations, maybe not so much the exact list of questions that we will take consistently to every different group. And it's not necessarily that the data points or the reference points or the viewpoints will change depending on what group we're speaking to, but contextually, as we're reaching out, whether it's to a business group, a sports group, an equity deserving group, we might want to contextually change the framing of the questions to be a bit more direct to how they interact with the city, or how we assume or acknowledge they would interact with the city, so that we can get to that, get to those pertinent questions. Because again, it's asking everybody a question about, what do you see the city's, do you think the city is transparent? Give us an A, B, C, or D option. Everyone is going to be happy to provide their thoughts on that. But then from a perspective of we are making recommendations to council to improve city operation, that actually doesn't help us understand what the problem is and why residents feel that, there is a certain deficiency when it comes to accountability. So it's really going to be trying to find that sweet spot of enough questions that provides us with, open-ended answers to understand where the concern is coming from and where the actual pressure point is, quantifying and qualifying that in a way that we can process for a report and process and compare with and track, for all intents and purposes, also track so that, hopefully 2-3 years from now, changes have been made and the city can examine sort of what came out of this process and if there have been market improvements about how residents and community members feel about how the city is operating. And then also getting to practical recommendations that can be included. We'll say appreciate and like the idea of allowing residents to point to things that the city is doing well. I think what might be a beneficial, if we go in that direction and if we do that, what might be beneficial is offering up examples of examples of things that the city or tools that the city are using or practices that the city has to share information may be beneficial here, because generally speaking, or from past experiences on engagements, as you're kind of exploring as you're sort of exploring themes around deficiencies or people's frustrations, it can often be difficult for people to flip a switch to find that positive. So it might necessitate us providing some examples and providing some opportunities. Hey, the city is doing X, Y, and Z. Are these the type of things that you would like to see, or have you seen them, or do you think it's beneficial?
Thank you for that. Anybody else? I'd like to add one thing if we're going to be finished this. I got a word, practical. Everybody's a different kind of definition of what that means. The reason I'm bringing it up is because we haven't heard from the people yet, right? So as information starts to come in, it may be a little worse than we had anticipated, and maybe practical isn't going to do it. And I'd like to talk maybe offline when we have our other meetings, when we're organizing it, to talk a bit about what if that is the case. There may be things that are being suggested that the chasm is so wide it may take a person. The chasm is so wide it may take software, capital infrastructure. There could be costs attached to these recommendations. We need to be very aware of what they may be, but we also need to be aware of what practical means. And I know we keep saying it over and over, but I hate to get to the end and say, well, we're going to do practical, but now we're going to recommend X, Y, Z. How do you segue that? How do we bridge that?
Of course, I think that's a great question. My first comment here is going to be explaining what I think when I think of the word practical and how I have processed the word practical as we see out, and maybe this is something that we need to tweak from a language perspective. But when we talk about when I talk about practical recommendations to council, I think there's an obvious thing that is going to happen throughout this process, in which we are going to get a lot of responses the city needs to be more forthcoming with information. The city needs to present information. The city needs to let us know about these changes before it happens. That is a recommendation. That is something that we know the city needs to improve on. In my brain, I do not process that as a practical recommendation, because if our report turns around and turns to council and says, you need to communicate better with the public, that doesn't actually give something tangible that can be improved. So maybe that is, and intangible is maybe not the right word, but in my mind, practical and tangible are interchangeable in this case, where it's not so much that there's not a cost, it's not so much that, it's not an investment, it has nothing, it's not an easy change, it's a specific recommendation and a specific change that residents feel will improve the city's operation. So instead of, you need to communicate better, and I'm going to pick on the sports references, unfortunately, but if the city is going to make a decision in terms of closing parks due to incoming weather, these decisions need to be made X amount of hours before the intended use of that park or use of that facility, not right up until the last minute. Obviously, there's pros and cons with that, but that is a tangible change that provides certainty, that provides an actual communication channel and communication stability to folks that maybe are frustrated by that. So practical, tangible, something that is actually specific, that we, as a task force, you can track and you can see whether or not that physically has been advanced, or if it hasn't, why it hasn't been. Because again, if the recommendation is, you need to communicate better, it's very easy to say yes without actually seeing what changes are made or seeing any proof in the pudding, as it would.
I think because I believe that some of those recommendations may contain more than just a tweak in timing and when you give out notice and those kinds of things, because you leave things for so long and a lot of things pile up, and just a couple runs at it aren't going to do it. We got to look at a longer plan, but how does this plan benefit in the long run, no matter what we do next, right? And I really think it's important that we don't, we look under every stone and give every idea a credible shot at actually becoming true as far as a recommendation, than just saying, well, that's not too practical, right? So I just was going to talk about that in the off when we start organizing, but I'm really I think that's a point we got to nail down. Anything else?
Sorry,
Jay.
and just to respond to that as well, I
Wait,
also
wait,
think.
one last thing is, because we might want to add an extra question. That's all I'm saying. That's why it came up in this thing. That's all.
Of course, and happy to look at questions and happy to add anything else to collect more feedback and more ideas. I also would say, I also would say from our process or my perspective as we're talking about this, there is an impetus for us to bring forward tangible, practical recommendations that we know the city can act on. I do not think it should, and I do not think it should preclude the general thoughts, feedback, and suggestions from coming through in that final report. So I think there is almost maybe, two closing sections of the report, one of which that explores maybe at a higher level where the improvements need to be made, what could be done, some of those big longer term thinkings of, maybe the city has to reorganize its communication structures and
Or maybe it's just by the numbers. You got 5 people dealing with 700,000 people.
Yeah.
How the hell are they going to be successful doing anything with that tsunami coming at them? So I'm just saying, I want to be very open about what those recommendations are. And I don't want the word practical to squeeze me down to something that's cheap, and affordable, and all you got to do is just change the schedule.
Absolutely not. I would say nothing in what will be reflective in the final report that we come to is going to be discarded because it's going to be hard to do or difficult to do or costly to do. I think it's just a matter of it's a specific tangible recommendation, something that we can hold on to in terms of a number, an improvement, a system change, a process change, a hiring, a reshift of organizational structures, rather than saying you should communicate to the public better.
I think another part too is we want it to be measurable. Right? That we can measure against it year after year after year. Is there improvement? Is there change? Is it going in the right direction? So we want to make sure, something as communicate better, okay, too subjective, right? We want to make sure it at least has that kind of specificity that it could be measured against.
Thank you for that.
Joanne, I'll just add a perspective to it. I mean, if you look forward, what ultimately is really going to matter is the policy decisions that City Council makes as a result, and the de facto enactment by the City of Hamilton of the recommendations in progress, right? So at the end, that's what matters. I mean, we can deliver a report and, if nothing happens from the report, then, it doesn't go too far either. So that's what really matters. But if you take one step back, our report and recommendations do matter in the way that we deliver them in the context. And I think it was well noted by Enterprise. I mean, there's 2 major components, one which is somewhat filtered, and we'll collectively get to this as we near towards the end of the process, is deciding what our actual recommendations are. Our committee, with the engagement of our partners, is making recommendations, and we want those recommendations to be as useful and relevant and reflective as possible. There's also another section of the report which is a little bit less filtered, which is what we heard. So letting everybody know and reflecting back the fact that people shared all these perspectives, but also noting that even in our democratic system, we have representatives that we elect because 500,000 people can't give their perspective on everything every single day. So that's part of the process. So I think it behooves us to report back on what we heard broadly, and then to assist City Council and the City of Hamilton in interpreting all of that feedback into useful things, and those essentially are our recommendations. So I'll look forward to collecting all of our inputs, and then our big task in front of us then will be intensively towards end of year saying, okay, what do we think of this, and what are we going to recommend? And really good conversation just on what some of the elements and perspectives around the recommendation should be, right? Contextual, measurable, relevant, impactful, et cetera.
Thank you for that. My last note is you can get past a lot of things. Trust is pretty big. So in order to come back with recommendations that are really going to chip away at that and strengthen that connection is going to be quite difficult. But I'm not saying impossible, but I just don't want to be limited in the arsenal of things we can bring to bear for the city to actually improve that relationship. Also, too, if we had a dashboard, you'd know if you were doing well because it would say it on that dashboard. So that's another thing that we were talking about constantly. It shows what the city's doing well, and it shows where there might be a lagging for everybody to just click on and see. And I think that would be a good way to be able to have a discussion on that as well. Any last comments on that at all? Any last comments? No? Okay, so we're going to move on to the project work plan. Now, I'm going to put this one off to you, Mark, if I may. I don't know what we want to get out of it other than just to approve that we're at that point, or do we want to ask people where they want to put their time, or do you want to wait for an actual schedule of events to come out?
Yeah, thanks, Joanne. I mean, so there's all this stuff we talked about, and now there's, actually doing it, turning it from the conceptual to the action. So I actually think for us all collectively here, it might be useful to just do a skim through and validate that, our updated work plan makes sense for everybody, and also considering everybody's roles in the activities. So I think, we don't have to go through line by line, but maybe we can kind of go through just quickly block by block and validate for all of us that those scopes of activities that we just talked about, that we're confident in executing them within the timeframes that are in front of us. Jesse, do you want to maybe take a lead and just kind of skimming through as you guys had done the most recent updates, and we'll all chip in?
Yeah, of course. And I'll provide some high-level thoughts here and sort of walk through sort of how we see this. So maybe going back to a comment that I made earlier to ensure that it's in the back of our minds as we're processing this, is that the actual open consultation portion, whether it is with individuals at the City of Hamilton or whether community members, we want to ensure taking place at the exact same time. Doesn't mean that the background work cannot start or shouldn't start to try to set some of these things up in place, just given calendar scheduling and everything else. But realistically speaking, we see the consultative period as being sort of one and the same amongst all partners. So when looking through this, and I know this is not going line by line, but going broader, is we see that consultative period starting immediately after Labor Day. And essentially September and October being the 2 months that it is all hands on deck to go through the actual consultation and get all the feedback. August we see as, finalizing and a bit more of the operational side of things, in which we would be working on finalizing all the discussion guides, the public facing materials and communication materials, ensuring that we have a plan in place and are already reaching out to all the different groups that we want to speak to, so that, we can reach out to city councilors and we can reach out to community partners and say, hey, this public consultation is starting on September, I'm going to say the 2nd, but it's not the 2nd. This consultation is starting on September 2nd. We are looking to schedule a one-on-one interview. Would you be interested in hosting a roundtable? Here are your opportunities to potentially publicly delegate. If you're interested in any of those, let us know and we'll work at scheduling it and setting everything up. So again, really taking the next 2 or 3 weeks to focus on operationally making sure that we're reaching out to folks, finalizing our outreach lists, finalizing the survey questions, and everything else, so that come that start date, that first week of September, we can effectively say go. We know the first weeks of September is back to school, people kind of getting back into the thick of things. So not expecting a robust engagement in that first week, but at least the process has started. We are open, and everything over the next 4 weeks can set up to choose some more of those engagements. Coming from that, we really see, sometime after the 16th of September, through conversations with ourselves and SPRC, would recommend that after the 16th is when we'd focus in on focus groups and some of those larger conversations. Again, just knowing that if we offer up a delegation opportunity or a focus group opportunity for the 5th of September, people are probably focused on the swing of life rather than engaging with a public consultative process. So focusing in mid-September to, let's say, middle of October, to really host a lot of those roundtables, those conversations, those delegations. This is extended and sort of reflected, we talk about in this group, we talk about doing some of the public delegations the weeks of September 19th and 16th. A great comment and a great point that SPRC and Kim had brought up is perhaps we should actually look at a September and an October date, so that there is a month between, so that those that, again, you can sort of see that September date as maybe those that are going to be interacting with us from a work perspective or an advocacy or a volunteer perspective, be a lot more inclined or have a lot more capacity to interact with us early. Whereas, folks from equity deserving communities or folks that are doing it because of their, engaged resident may need a bit more time and may be more better suited to interact with us in October. All in all, I would say we really want to, I think our goal here is to ensure that come Halloween and come the end of October, we've really wrapped up all of our engagements, focusing that, that later half of October around I don't want to say cleanup, but let's call it cleanup in terms of, okay, great, we need to make an extra emphasis or extra outreach in, we've heard from every ward except for one. What do we need to do to try to get information back and feedback from that ward? Or, we've talked to a lot of great community partners, but we're really missing, neighborhood associations, or we're really missing a perspective from newcomers organizations. We really need to put some extra focus there to ensure that, again, not that we're guaranteed to talk to everybody, but that we've made a specific effort to try to ensure that everyone has the opportunity to engage. And then coming from that, November, December is really just internally focused. We would start this work a little bit earlier as engagements wrap up in terms of distilling the information and starting to look at it and to start to see where the themes are coming out, to start planning for the report and planning for the recommendations. But November and December would really be focused on our work of coming to a final draft report, coming to recommendations, and coming to next steps.
Anybody else have, I just want to add a potential other survey. I want to add on this work plan for the first thing for workers in Hamilton. We'll have a discussion in our working group on that, I guess, when we get together and shore up some things. Anybody has any questions? Madeline? No?
I'll just say, I like the plan. I think that it's a tight plan. I think we can do it, but we definitely got to stay on task. And I think the general notion of finalizing basically, for example, the things we talked about today by the end of the month, kind of lining up our partners, support from city staff in terms of communications, things like that, getting out there and basically keeping that tight time frame of September and October for our engagement activities, giving ourselves a little bit of slack, but then moving into really November for compiling the report. I think it makes sense. It keeps us generally in line with our initial timeframes. There's probably some dates we don't have to do it today, but we can even go back and just get certain specific dates in the calendar. But I think this plays out into then a more extensive checklist of activities and dates that build from here. But I think the general plan is strong.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Sue. Taneshi?
I know we had talked about delegations before, so I'm wondering from the city perspective, the planning or the scheduling of that, how soon should we be having those booked? And maybe that might be something we want to kind of get going as soon as possible.
Clerk?
Thank you for the question. Lorraine Cole, our legislative coordinator. One tiny detail in the document, the next, the September meeting of the task force is the 18th, so we could look to that meeting to be the one of the first meetings of the task force to take in those public delegations. Also, an additional, I know that the task force previously discussed having an evening meeting to allow for more delegations. So any of the public delegations would come through a meeting of the task force. It's just a matter of scheduling them. And then also bringing in all the players so that everyone is there when the public delegations are coming in to speak.
Have we only had one request, Lorraine?
So far, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So why don't a suggestion, in our communications, we can say that our standing September and October meetings we'll invite people to, and let's set up one other evening time. Yeah.
So will we use the whole meeting as a delegation time? Might as well, right? Other than passing
Yes, I would,
minutes and stuff.
yes. And also, it would, for the task force members, it would probably, or we could have, depending on the number of delegates, we could have it run longer than the usual 2-hour timeframe.
Excellent. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions, concerns? Madeline up here? Ted? Nope.
Maybe just a question as well, or a comment to the group, and I don't know if this is operationally possible, so this is me getting ahead of myself and just throwing a lob to the group. But something to consider as well for those delegation meetings is whether or not any of the other City of Hamilton facilities is potentially set up properly to take in delegations, just thinking that obviously City Hall is quite accessible in downtown, but there might be, there could be an argument or a case to make, whether it's the Stony Creek Municipal Center or somewhere else where we can, if we're doing an evening session, could reach into some of the more suburban, rural wards that have a lot of folks coming in and out of the city. But again, I don't know if that's operationally
Well, I mean, she
possible,
knows
so
everything.
apologies for lobbing that one to
I
the
would have
group.
to look into it. Any meeting of the task force is a public meeting that needs to be live streamed, et cetera, but we can certainly look into having a meeting elsewhere if at another city facility.
And just to confirm, Lorraine, I mean, all of these delegation requests as well are virtually accessible. So
Correct,
Yeah.
yes. So as with any delegate to any committee, they are given the opportunity to send a written submission, attend virtually, send us a pre-recorded video, or attend in person. So there are actually 4 options.
So just to clarify, since we're on it, so if there was a pre-recorded, you would support us in having that prepared to be played? And then
Yes.
if there was a written submission, how does that work?
They end up on the agenda under communication items, and so they will be public documents.
Okay. But the floor is open to any and all comments on the work plan that we are mutually all committing ourselves to.
Well, this looks pretty good. All right, that concludes the attachments. So if, and thank you for all of the hard work on those documents. It was a great conversation today. May I have a mover and a seconder to approve the items? Mover, Tanashi. Seconder, Madeline. Thank you for volunteering. Madeline, all in favor? Carried. Way to go. That's a great meeting today. Okay, general information and other business. Is there any other business today? May I have a mover and a seconder to adjourn today's meeting? Thank you, Tanashi. Thank you, Mark. All right. And today's meeting is adjourned. Thank you, Madam Clerk. Thank you,
Thank you,
Co-Chair. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.